So a very good day and a warm welcome from my side as well to our conference, Gego, Presidencia y Encuentro, at the Kunstmuseum in Stuttgart. As the Spanish title of this conference indicates, we will, and which was also taken from Gego's own notes, we will be looking at Gego's origins here in Germany, as well as her many encounters here and later in Venezuela, where she became the artist that we know in the mid-1950s. Welcome, dear family and friends of Gego, as well as all scholars and admirers of Gego's work who are joining us for this conference here and online, of course. It's a real pleasure having you all with us today. I look forward as well, of course, to the many interesting lectures by my colleagues who have, in some cases, really been working on Gego for many years and sometimes even decades. And then there is others who will share entirely new perspectives on Gego's work. It's been continuously and sincerely noted that Gego's architectural training in Stuttgart must have been very influential for her artistic practice. It was never fully researched, however, and hence became the main subject of my research and the exhibition project I conducted over the past years. As said in the introduction, it would have not come into being if it wasn't for Ulrike Groß and Eva Marina Freudsheim, who organized and curated or co-curated the exhibition Gego Line as Object together with the Kunsthalle Hamburg and the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. And subsequently, together with the Fundación Gego, brought a collection of 100 works to the museum as a long-term loan. And therewith, they raised the awareness that yet there's still a lot to be done on Gego's study years, from 1932 to 1938 at the Technische Hochschule in Stuttgart. Also, Kerstin Thomas and Philipp Kurz, of course, understood the importance of doing so, and together with Ulrike created this very unique position for me that enabled me to implement a thorough research project and on Gego's training, as well as her professors and the many encounters that she had. As you will see, I was not only able to collect unknown material with, but also with the exhibition, just to maybe go a bit further already. With the exhibition, Gego, the architecture of an artist, I was able to relate the research to Gego's artistic work. A work that is complex and continuously referencing itself while being developed further. Gego's practice was always open to new encounters, whilst the artist would not give up on her origins, which brings me to the topic of my following lecture, Gego's origins in Stuttgart. I may begin with an until recently unknown encounter Gego had while studying here. The one with the Jewish textile artist, Victoria Regina Mincina, who then was a well-acclaimed artist and a member of the November group. The art historian and Gego's professor Hans Hildebrand described Regina Mincina's weavings as free and organic. Of her tapestries, whose designs she developed out of color and rhythm, only a few have survived. The work in view in my exhibition was preserved by her great-grandchildren in Tasmania and is being shown again in Stuttgart for some 100 years. Gego had visited the artist regularly in her studio and remembered their meetings as follows, quote, "For me, being with her was always wonderful and dangerous. So much the artist, I believed I could not do that as an architect." And it is interesting how Gego then was concerned with the discrepancies between the arts, how she thought of being either an artist or an architect. Gego wrote those lines to the daughter of the artist in 1947. That is only a few years before she would begin her own artistic practice, with which she later united several supposedly different professions, also including those of the architect and the weaver. For example, her last group of works, the hiduras or weavings, are made out of strips of paper and cardboard supplement. Moreover, Gego's own rare textile works are little known and partially even lost. To also contextualize the importance of weaving in the architectural discourse, I would like to at least refer to the Hamburgian architect and theorist Gottfried Semper, who in the middle of the 19th century drew attention to the role that textiles play for architecture, by referring to the fact that the earliest nomadic dwellings were actually weavings. And since the beginning of building coincided with the beginning of textiles, he opposed thinking of architecture in blocks and argued for an architectural understanding more related to the act of weaving. This reference really can only function as an opening image that should guide us through the next 30 minutes or so, in which I will try to untie a very complex interweaving of Gego's practice with a focus on drawing techniques she learned in Stuttgart. From the mid-1950s until the early 1990s, Gego developed a multi-dimensional art practice that began with an architectural training. A training, I argue, was constitutive for Gego's entire artistic work and is specific to its time and place of education. Die Hamburg-born Gertrud Luise Goldschmidt enrolled at the Technische Hochschule Stuttgart on October 29, 1932, to study architecture and engineering. She was 20 years old and had just completed an internship with a workshop in Hamburg for decorative painting, something that was considered a prerequisite for the admission to the university. Without going into any statistics, it can be said that in contrast to other technical colleges in Germany, the number of Jewish students in Stuttgart remained relatively constant until 1938. The number of female Jewish architecture students, however, was vanishingly small, and during her studies, Gego was one of 6 Jewish female architecture students, and in some semesters she was even the only one. Her student years in general coincided with a period in architectural history when the Reformist teachings of the Stuttgart school were already well established, yet it is primarily remembered as a time of dispute between modernists and traditionalists' positions. To this day, the iconic Weissenhof housing development, which was built between 1925 and 27 on the hills of Stuttgart, still embodies the conflict between formal approaches and marks the point where 2 Reformist schools parted ways. The role politics played into this cannot nearly be discussed in this context, but at least has to be acknowledged. However, the educational foundations for both schools were laid much earlier. Already in 1901, the Technische Hochschule had begun to play a pioneering role in its educational practice. In view of the innovations in material and construction technology at the time, there was a call for a new approach to building, and having said that, it wasn't quite clear how this new building should look like, actually. So that led to a restructured curriculum, which was initiated by Theodor Fischer, and who then became also a founding member of the Deutsche Werkbund. And the innovations that the Werkbund also called for in reaction to industrialization, again, basically continued to have a pedagogical impact on the schools, such as the Bauhaus and the Technische Hochschule. Fischer prepared for all this in Stuttgart and fundamentally reformed the curriculum by demanding that new challenges in urban planning should be tackled according to both artistic and technical principles, that architecture should blend into the surrounding landscape, and that the new technical possibilities should be coordinated with artisanal and local traditions. Further, to ensure that the students did not lose sight of practical applications, training workshops and compulsory professional internships became mandatory. Fischer also explicitly promoted an artistic education to nourish the creative spirit of the students. And to this end, artists such as Karl Schmoll von Eisenwerth or Rudolf Burkhardt, of whom I will be speaking later, were recruited to the institute. So these defining futures established also included a systematic and multidisciplinary teaching structure and, as well, a pluralism of style, meaning that approaches of the various professors reflected both traditional and modern perspectives on architecture. And these cornerstones, and that's important, remained in place until the late 1930s, and therefore count for Gego's curriculum too. Considering how much there was lost during the Second World War, it's actually a miracle that anything that relates to Gego's studies or her study years survived at the University Archive of Stuttgart. Hence, it is even more surprising that Gego's student file, including single exam certificates, a record card of her exams, and the application for her diploma certificate are preserved. Also, there is an index card that was renewed by the Nazis in 1936 to basically systematically categorize the young student Gertrud Goldschmidt as a female with the red diagonal and a Jew with the yellow color of the paper. And the program books, including all lecturers and their courses of each semester, survived. At the Fundación Gego in Caracas, on the other hand, we found a record book and internship certificates, as well as a few of her student projects. And in addition to these primary sources, the University Archive holds a bequest of works by fellow students who took courses together with Gego. And all this material, and more, of course, which I'm not able to show in this context, but it enabled me to reconstruct Gego's entire curriculum in very detail for the first time. And I will try and give a very brief overview of the curriculum now, but I think since it's never been shown or seen in that entirety, I just wanted to give a small grasp of what it looked like before I go into selected professors and their teachings. During Gego's undergraduate studies, which are those 4 semesters here, Gego completed mostly courses on various drawing practices, including freehand drawing, geometric projection methods, perspective and shadow constructions, as well as a detailed representation of structural engineering projects. And in her 3rd semester, Gego completed the first 3 months of a compulsory internship at the architectural firm Bloch & Guggenheimer, where she worked on the planning of a rush project for the Jewish community in Stuttgart. And after the 4th semester, as scheduled, Gego officially dropped out of the program in order to complete her internship year. Initially, she returned to her hometown of Hamburg and worked for the architect Bernd Engel, who soon after was also banned from practicing due to his Jewish ancestry, and therefore Gego had to head back to Stuttgart, where she took all the necessary examinations to complete the lower level of her studies. In May 1935, she then began working with Bodo Rasch There, Gego designed interiors and furniture, which is considerably interesting, especially in regard to her own furniture workshop, Taller Gego, which she ran in the 40s in Caracas. In October 35, Gego enrolled again to complete the second stage of her studies. In addition to continuing with subjects such as building theory, architectural history, and structural design, she now supplemented her timetable with courses in planning such as urban planning and design. And towards the end of her studies, participation in public life really became increasingly difficult for Gego, and her freedom of movement had been severely restricted. On July 1st, 1938, Gego took her diploma examination. However, she did not receive a certificate until November 24, 1938, which is extremely important because this is 14 days after the so-called Night of the Broken Glass, which is followed or was followed by the expulsion of all Jewish students from universities in Germany. And therefore, Gego counts to the very last, very, very last Jewish students to receive an official diploma in Germany after the November pogroms. Her professors Heinz Wetzel and Wilhelm Tietje, Paul Bronatz, and his secretary, whose name is not recorded, played a significant role in making this and subsequently also Gego's legal departure from Germany possible. Right after the exams, Gego started applying for visas all over the world. In April 1939, she then wrote to a fellow student, "It's terrible," quote, "it's terrible, but I'm still stuck in Hamburg." And shortly after then, she was granted a residency permit for Venezuela, where she escaped to on June 2nd, 1939. I'll try to speed this up, but I think it's really important because her immigration file shows that Gego intended to bring all necessary work material, which should have allowed for a good start in her trained profession. Once arrived in Caracas, Gego soon had to learn that she could not grasp a foothold as an architect, mainly because she was a female immigrant trained in a technical profession, which she also stated in her reparation file. And also given the boom of building in the city and the many male European architects who were involved, I think it's relatively clear why she wasn't able to work as an architect. So only in the mid-1950s, when Gego then withdrew to the countryside of Tarma, she began to give art making a serious place in her life. And at the same time, she very confidently wrote to her former professor, Paul Bronatz, quote, "Even though I may have been lost to architecture and was unable to master life through it, it has shaped me, certainly, to some extent," end quote. So who were those formative characters for Gego in Stuttgart, and how did they shape her, as she implies? So in the following, I will present a selection of a few influential characters that Gego encountered here in Stuttgart, and will give a special attention to the medium of drawing, which always remained important to Gego. Different line practices and projection methods helped Gego later to translate her strokes into three-dimensional large-scale installations. She was trained to develop her ideas in various ways on paper, from technical projections to sketches and freehand drawings, while in parallel reflecting on material and the physical effect of the developed form in space. As said, Gego learned different drawing techniques. For example, the architect Wilhelm Tietje, together with the artist Rudolf Burkhardt, taught constructive and planning methods in a two-part technical drawing course. It was divided in descriptive geometry and perspectives and shading constructions. At first, the students learned different projection methods for rendering three-dimensional volumes in 2 dimensions, without perspective and true to scale. And then they were taught to render properly the laws of perspective and the cast shadows of the volumes in space. Later, Tietje wrote also in his textbook, Körper und Raum, Body and Space, quote, that descriptive geometry teaches us to depict a spatial form in a plane so that the form and the size of the object are evident from drawing, end quote. So that's that's relatively clear, but then he goes on and says basically that this could only be approached, however, with a certain clarity based on abstract thinking. By that, he meant that perceptions, ideas, and projections of space are subject to a constant process of translation that can be captured by geometric drawing. And on that note, of course, it again becomes a process of translation when being built, because those equivalents of points and straight lines and delimited planes do not exist in the real world. According to Tietje, every space is composed by internal connections and correlations that define formation and structure of that space. Therefore, the relationship between building volumes and their environment has to be taken into account when drawing plans. Further, the means of design include not only the intersection and interpenetration of straight lines and planes and volumes, but also the interaction of immaterial light and solid materials. Hence, Gego was taught a comprehensive understanding of architecture that was based not only on rendering, but also perceiving. The spatial body should be understood as an interplay of material, form, light, shadow, and space that puts everything onto one scale. This becomes evident when looking at a drawing by Gego's fellow student, Werner Hasper, who used a single-point perspective to construct an elevated and covered portal. The different levels of space are staggered from the steps by the way of the porch to the exterior shutters and the masonry, and finally also the front door, which again is fitted with transparent windows. Those openings, so depicted, these windows, point in turn to an invisible interior behind them. The portal has windows on its sides, and consequently the light shines through this threshold architectural space and develops a rhythmic play of light and shadow, and makes it also look three-dimensional, of course, on the plane. So these intermeshings of spatial levels, transparency, and opacity as well, as light and shadow, pointed to the way of Gego's later artistic practice. It's, of course, often architectural drawing as such, we just seen, are primarily thought to serve as a medium of communication, meaning that every building is built geometry and hence can be represented with an adequate drawing abilities. In that sense, geometry is to be understood as the grammar of constructive drawing, really, with the aid of which spatial relationships can be expressed on a plane by means of abstraction. Gego herself wrote about this years later when she said, quote, "I was trained as an architect, committed to draw lines with definite meaning," end quote. But it is, of course, a long process from the design sketch to the build volume, and architectural drawings are never purely illustrative or exclusively serve communication. Rather, architecture is developed with or by means of drawing. In that respect, the artistic idea also takes priority. And accordingly, Gego was trained in artistic freehand drawing to find forms with singular strokes and ascribe volumes with the characteristic surfaces. From the painter and graphic artist Karl Schmoll von Eisenwerth specifically, she learned to use free hatching techniques and line practices, as well as watercolor painting, to give shape to the three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional plane. Gego enrolled in his courses far more than she had to, according to the curriculum. And that clearly points to an early appreciation of the artistic aspect of drawing. It was Eisenwert's belief that behind good architecture, there always stands a good artist. And he recorded his pedagogical approach in a manuscript which is called which he titled the Grammatik des Zeichnens, the Grammar of Drawing, in which he wrote about the true artist who could harmonize constructive and essential form, with which he implied an inner structure, with apparent form referring to a surface of that form, and through the targeted use of technical means by which he actually meant drawing. A considered focus on how forms relate to one another would ultimately produce an artistic expression. His aim was to teach how to capture form structurally, transfer it to the plane using special hatching techniques, and nevertheless produce rhythmic spaces. If the object in it appeared in different depths, they can be connected via spatial joints. And I also have an excursion on how Gego developed his thoughts further, also in relation to Buckminster Fuller's Jitterbug transformation, but let's stay in Stuttgart for today. So for Eisenwert, his students should learn to create a built visual image, just as they're supposed to create spatial organisms when designing and building. Together with a well-trained spatial imagination, these spatial organisms, composed of volume, light, and shadow, as well as overlaps and interpenetrations, can be brought to paper. For him, the line is a mean of expressing spatial relations, and was also a language of translation, yet again. Although, and this is particularly interesting for Eisenwert, the degree of the abstraction is always ought to be left to the artist, it is important not to entirely negate spatiality and to always show what is essential about the situation. So when considering Gego's work, one might ask, what is the essence of her art? Is it space per se, as she indicated in a note from 1966? I'll only read the translation from the German note which also is particularly interesting because she always switches between German, English, and Spanish. The English translation says, mastery of space over which reason becomes the ruler, tries to become I. Gego's attempt to master space is clearly evident in her works. Especially in her works on paper, she developed abstract spatial configurations by employing planes and various practices for lines. Space is not ruled by reason, but can be developed independently of linear limitations, thanks to a certain measure of abstraction. Like Eisenwert, Gego was seeking a path to convey space through representation in a plane. Areas of varied hatchings are opened up and staggered and overlapped, and the space between the strokes and lines makes it possible to relate different pictorial levels. Eisenwert also generally distinguished between planal and spatial art, but sought ways to reconcile the two with the medium of murals and reliefs. Quote, when the spatial architecture of the relief space vibrates in harmony with the spatial idea of the building, and the rhythm of the plane in color and form joins its rhythm, meaning the rhythm of the building, the apparent contradiction of plane space can be resolved, end quote. And this is actually especially interesting when looking at Gego's works in public spaces, which you realized from the 1950s onwards, but especially with the one murals at the INSE building in Caracas, which she developed together with her partner Gerd Leufert on 3 facades of the INSE building. They used uncircumscribed lines in the form of parallel hatching of objects, the metal rods, in order to, I have a detailed, in order to describe planes. As in her drawings, the distance between the rods permits transparency and evokes spatiality. And the gasoline-colored articulations on the western facade, again, bridge and connect 2 spatial separated planes. The corporeal planes of lines stand out from the color ground in a rhythmic composition of metal rods that resonate with the host architecture. Gego's mural is a relief in the end, and the base, which is in the classical architectonic sense, the load barrier, is dissolved visually. Gego replaces monumentality with lightness and rhythm. Moreover, looking at the archival material at the Fundación Gego, it becomes evident that while developing this work, she employed the medium of drawing in its full spectrum, from sketches by way of color studies to plans. And regarding this work process, Gego noted something interesting that relates to these corporal hatchings, as I called it before, with the metal rods, because while preparing for the first retrospective at the Museo de Arte Contemporánea in Caracas in 1977, she drew up, together with the art critic Hani Osot, a formalist classification of her oeuvre and gathered a group of works under the rubric parallel lines. With these parallel lines, as she says, she attempted to dissolve surfaces with lines and the spaces between them. Particularly in her earlier drawings and etchings, Gego works with parallel or near parallel lines, assembling them into planes of lines that are overlapping and layered and cut into each other. And in this way, the image support also increasingly loses its presence, even if it actually dominates, in terms of the surface area. And in her 3-dimensional works, she succeeded through the use of those parallel lines in integrating the space on both sides of the surface, as she attempted in her own words. So it's evident that these parallel lines were instrumental for Gego, but again, one could ask, where did she drew them from, or where did they derive from? So looking again at the coursework of Gego's fellow students, it becomes clear that parallel hatching very evidently is a creative means of marking surfaces. It defines the material and the degree of transparency or opacity of a surface, as well as the light and the shadow conditions that affect it. In general, different line practices in architectural drawing serve to convey different information. The freer a stroke, the more undefined and organic the thing to be depicted, the more delineated the form described, the more static the pictorial object, and then juxtaposed vertical and horizontal parallel lines yield a fixed grid, but then adapted to a certain topography, this grid becomes looser again, as you can say, with the topography lines around the layout of a housing development. Gego learned all this in Stuttgart, evidently, but later she translated this knowledge into a playful artistic practice that far exceeded the limitations of the paper plane. What always remained was the parallelism of precision and liveliness, as the work Carta indicates. And given the time, I will now come to the last 2 encounters and therewith to the second phase, actually, also of Gego's studies, when she learned the more practical career aspects. For example, with Heinz Wetzel, In his course on urban planning, his focus was on a true to-life approach. By taking strolls through the city, he prepared his students for realism, which provided a good grasp of spatial relationships. The tiny medieval town served as the ideal, since it had grown naturally and organically and was built around social centers such as churches, which is also evident in very early drawings and aquarelles that she would go back to her study material where they actually had to draw those medieval towns with a dedicated focus to those social centers, as you can see with the church tower. Wetzel's approach was integrative and above all alive. Quote, "I am interested in the geometric that can be recorded by numbers, but only from the point where the concept of so-called geometry is somewhat spoiled by raw reality. In other words, where the geometric form is forced out of the sphere of abstraction and into the living reality by its relation to its surrounding. The rhythm of reality," end quote. So far from any rigid formalism, one actually must add, he taught a site-specific art of building. The rhythm of reality, which results from accents on landscapes and spaces as well as on lines of vision, should become part of the planning. The influence of these comprehensive concepts of spatial design can again be felt in Gego's works in public spaces that she realized in subway stations like the Quadriláteros she built in 1983, in interior courtyards of a shopping center with Fletchers, which is unfortunately lost, and in large building complexes that combine housing, shopping, and culture. They all include daily life movement. And in her installative exhibition concepts she then developed from the late 1960s onwards, she also broke with the calculable structures of forms as Wetzel suggested and opened them up to a non-static and lived reality, which she already thought of while drawing those installation plans. So, coming to the last figure that I would like to present is Bodo Rasch, and for Bodo Rasch also movement and rhythm was very important. He was Gego's boss for a couple of months here in Stuttgart and very formative, I would argue, for Gego's later artistic thinking. Rasch was a self-taught in construction technology and was a designer and a visionary, and he substantially influenced the Stuttgart avant-garde. He and his brother Heinz Rasch are known above all for innovative suspension constructions, also being in a quarrel with Buckminster Fuller about who developed it first at a given point, but also that is just an anecdote perhaps. So, in his manuscripts, though preserved amongst his papers, Rasch recorded his reflections on forming space in architectural work. So here he is. A particularly interesting aspect is that he sought to transition the function of the space into the movement through that given space, and therewith he determined the form of that space. For Rasch, architecture is therefore four-dimensional because you always have to include that given movement through that particular space. And it's an active use also of space, so it's not kind of thought of again as a kind of a rigid rectangular drawing plan on paper, but more includes a temporal aspect while designing. The choreography ultimately defines the borders of a space, which can be closed, membrane-like, or even just projected mentally. Quote, "Today, buildings are even constructed without spatial boundaries. They are frames in which subordinated spatial boundaries or spaces are suspended or inserted. or in which the spatial boundaries are merely imagined so that they permit a fantastic illusion of spaces, end quote. And then really reading this manuscript, one has to think about Gego's reticularias, which are very well known, of course, and which functions also as a kind of organic and social sculpture in that they integrate visitors in their site-specific settings. At the time, at the same time, also they have this kind of technoid, innovative character, and thinking about engineering clearly helped Gego build these new artistic forms. But unlike Forage, however, for Gego, or Gego's membran-like net structures, or also her complex exhibition installations, did not result casually from a functional choreography, but rather they connected with those wandering through the space and create the four-dimensional installation, which again she indicates already in an installation plan drawings, but then even continues to grow this idea by inviting Sonia Sonoha into her retrospective 1977 to act with her work and create the performance, the Choreogegos. So I'm not even trying to make the attempt to make a conclusion, because I think what I've tried is to show how varied and multi-dimensional her education here in Stuttgart was, and I really only picked out a few of the characters who were influential to Gego's education and later also for artistic practice. And I mean, it's not just reading through these manuscripts that are partially not even published, so they really kind of stayed there for the last 70, 80 years, and in relation to Gego's works were at times really eye-opening. But she also stayed in touch with them when she was in Caracas, so she clearly valued these. And what is probably for me the most inspiring and interesting fact is that with this complexity of especially the focus on being trained in so many different drawing techniques, they almost subvert media specificity in its teaching, or the teachers kind of taught the students to overcome that, because the drawing yet was a medium which of course has its formalistic framework, but then on the other hand, every drawing already implicated various stagings of thinking, such as projection and the shadow and the reaction in space and the movement around it. So basically with every stroke there is so much more that Gego already had in mind while unfolding her multidimensional practice between the 50s and the 90s. And with these thoughts, I would actually like to open up for discussion. Thank you.